Welcome to Starbound's second channel. My name is Jack. I'll be your narrator today. Before we start the video, please just go below and check to see if you're subscribed. It's 100% free and it just allows our videos to pop up on your feed more often. Thanks for watching. Commander Orlo's scales pressed closer to his body as he regarded the trio of human cadets. Behind him, his three-fingered hands locked together, grip firm. The agricultural training field stretched out around them, a meticulous grid of cultivation zones where automated drones moved in their cycle of planting and growing. His tail shifted against the soil, betraying his unease at being saddled with Deathworlders' cadets, of all things. The morning light fell across the ancient Caladium ship that dominated the eastern perimeter of the field. Even after centuries of collecting dust, its hull maintained a haunting sort of majesty. Deep gouges and scorch marks told tales of its final battle, yet somehow the massive vessel had retained its structural integrity. Local children often whispered stories about the ghosts that must surely haunt its corridors, though Orlo knew better than to entertain such nonsense. Above them, the red moon hung like a bloated fruit in the morning sky, its surface dotted with the many different structures of the Inzian colony. The sight made Orlo's throat frill constrict involuntarily, even after stealing glances at it for all his life. To his eyes, the moon cast an unsettling crimson glow across the neat rows of their most profitable exports, jade-hued jade gourds, with their hypnotic swirling veins, bronze-flecked cinderthorn blooms arranged in perfect radial patterns, and the notorious fang fruit, with its silvery hide and threatening ridges. Orlo drew himself up to his full height, his ceremonial commander's sash catching the breeze. The motion highlighted the intricate patterns of his emerald and obsidian scales, a mark of his prestigious bloodline among the Anzian defense forces. His vertical pupils narrowed as he studied the humans before him, so alien with their soft, furless skin and flat faces. Their military uniforms seemed almost comically inadequate compared to the natural armor his own species possessed. The tallest of the humans, Cadet Jacob, stood at rigid attention, his black hair cropped close to his rounded skull. Unlike an Anzian's naturally perfect posture, he achieved his straightness through obvious muscular effort. Beside him, Cadet Ethan's olive skin had already begun to glisten with perspiration under the colony's hot climate. The standard-issue uniform strained across his shoulders, clearly designed for Anzian proportions rather than human bulk. Cadet Lucas completed the trio, his fair complexion already reddening despite the early hour. Freckles stood out like flecks of copper against his skin as he shifted his weight, drawing Orlo's disapproving glare. The tallest of the humans, Cadet Jacob, stood at rigid attention, his black hair cropped close to his rounded skull. Unlike an Anzian's naturally perfect posture, he achieved his straightness through obvious muscular effort, exactly the kind of military bearing Orlo would use against him. "Welcome to Military Training Station 7, Orlo announced, carefully choosing his words. "This facility serves as the primary grounds for our most traditional military exercises." The lie came easily, knowing these humans wouldn't question ancient alien training methods. Sir?" Ethan interrupted, eyes gleaming with ill-concealed interest. "The Caladium ship. Is it true no one's been inside for centuries? Will we be conducting breach exercises?" "The vessel is off-limits," Orlo snapped, pleased at how easily they accepted any activity as potential military training. He noticed all three cadets' attention had already shifted to the red moon looming above, his stomach scales clenched with familiar dread. What about the red moon, sir?" Lucas piped up, practically bouncing on his heels. "Is it true that all Inzian women have three big—" "That is not an appropriate topic of discussion." Orlo's throat furrow flared fully now, the opaque membrane catching the light as his voice reached a pitch that scattered the nearby flying animals. "The Inzians are not subjects for your perverted human curiosity." "We heard they can lift tanks with their minds," Jacob added helpfully. "Are we going to learn psionic defense techniques?" They are apex predators with psionic abilities that could crush your primitive ape brains without effort. Orlo's auxiliary breathing vents fluttered in agitation. The fact that they permit us to share this system is nothing but an act of kindness. You must respect them. His outburst echoed across the field, sending a flock of native creatures rising from a nearby jade gourd vine. The cadets finally fell quiet, though Orlo caught the mischievous glances they shared. It was a strange look, the kind that made his defensive scales prickle with foreboding. "Your quarters," he continued, gesturing toward a squat, prefabricated building, "have been constructed according to human specifications." The hastily assembled structure radiated the Defense Force's disdain, from its unpainted exterior to its non-existent climate control. "Spartan! Like real warrior quarters!" Ethan said with genuine appreciation, making Orlo suppress a smile at the human's naivety. "You will begin your training immediately," Orlo declared, already turning toward the drone control station. Today's exercises focus on endurance, strength, and precision handling of indigenous flora. These skills were once the backbone of the Anzian military. He almost admired how readily they accepted such obvious agricultural labor as combat training. "Yes, sir," they responded in unison, falling into step behind him at once. Their heavy boots pressed into the soil with what he considered unnecessary force. The ground beneath their feet was worth more than their quarterly wages, cultivated over generations to achieve the perfect mineral balance. Their eagerness to prove themselves as warriors would make them excellent farmhands, Orlo mused. After all, who would question the mysterious training methods of an alien military in an exchange program? Sir?" Lucas called out as they walked. "About those Ensian women." "Not another word." Orlo smiled inwardly. Let them focus their strange curiosity on the Ensian females. It would keep them from questioning why elite military training involved so much harvesting. The morning harvest began with the fang fruit, naturally. Orlo observed from his shaded position as the three humans approached the first row, their faces set with determined concentration. He hadn't bothered warning them about the razor-sharp ridges that gave the fruit its name. Such oversight seemed a fitting addition to their training. Cadet Ethan reached for the first specimen, his bare hand inches from disaster before Jacob caught his wrist. The taller cadet pointed to the protective gloves dangling from their belts, standard-issue equipment that Orlo had forgotten to mention during their brief orientation. Within moments, all three humans had their hands properly sheathed in the reinforced material. Orlo's throat frill contracted in mild disappointment. He'd hoped for at least one minor injury to remind them of their place. The humans settled into a work rhythm that defied Orlo's expectations. Ethan and Jacob worked in tandem, their movements becoming more precise with each fruit they harvested. Lucas developed a technique for sliding his gloved fingers beneath the fang fruit's defensive ridges, extracting each specimen with surprising grace. The morning's quota, which Orlo had deliberately set at an excessive level, disappeared into their collection bins as they smiled. By midday, when Anzian workers would typically require their first rest period, the humans showed no signs of fatigue. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat, their breathing heavy, but they did not slack. The sight of full collection bins lined up at the field's edge sent an uncomfortable sensation rippling through Orlo's scales. They moved to the jade gourds next, their heavy boots leaving deep impressions in the carefully maintained soil. Each gourd weighed as much as a young Anzian, their dense flesh protected by a skin that could deflect standard cutting tools. Orlo had assigned them the most primitive harvesting implements available, expecting frustration and failure. Instead, the humans took shortcuts. Ethan braced each jade gourd against his chest, using his body's strength to hold it steady, while Jacob made the precise cuts necessary for extraction. Lucas developed a rolling technique that allowed him to move each specimen with minimal strain. Their ability to work together without getting in each other's way felt insulting. The afternoon brought them to the cinderthorn blooms, perhaps the most demanding crop in the field. Each flower required exactly 7 points of contact to safely disconnect from its stem, with any deviation resulting in the immediate release of defensive spores. Orlo had witnessed seasoned Anzian workers spend weeks mastering the necessary pattern. The humans solved it in hours. They approached the task with some degree of caution, using their shorter fingers to their advantage as they worked through the complex sequence of movements. Their natural predisposition for pattern recognition served them with a great synergy with their strong bodies. As the sun began its descent, Orlo found his satisfaction at their manual labor curdling into something less comfortable. They had exceeded every quota and somehow maintained their military bearing throughout. Even now, as they assembled for his evening inspection, they stood at attention despite their obvious exhaustion. Your performance was... Orlo paused, searching for appropriately ambiguous praise. Noteworthy, though your technique lacks the refinement of traditional Anzian methods. Thank you, sir, Jacob responded, his voice steady despite the day's exertion. We're eager to learn your species' military techniques. Orlo's scales rippled at the sincerity in the cadet's voice. Tomorrow, we will advance to more challenging exercises. Sir? Lucas stepped forward, his face flushed, but eager. Will we be incorporating combat training with the agricultural procedures? I've been studying Anzian military history, and there are references to warriors using fang fruit as projectile weapons. The other cadets maintained their rigid posture, but Orlo caught the slight lift in their expressions. Their continued belief in the military nature of their labor would have been amusing if it weren't so troublingly effective. Your training will proceed according to ancient and proven methods, Orlo replied, the vagueness of his answer disguised by his authoritative tone. For now, return to your quarters, and prepare for tomorrow's exercises. I expect you at this position, first light. Yes, sir, they chorused, executing a precise about-face that seemed to mock the agricultural setting. As they marched toward their Spartan lodging, Orlo heard Ethan whisper, Maybe tomorrow we'll learn how to use those drones for tactical support. The alien girls, with the set of 3 big green, Jacob attempted. I heard that, cadet, Orlo bellowed. The humans disappeared into their quarters, leaving Orlo alone with his increasingly uncertain thoughts. He had intended to put them in their place through mundane labor, but their performance raised uncomfortable questions about their capabilities. The way they maintained their military discipline while performing decidedly non-military tasks was concerning. Orlo gazed up at the red moon, now rising to dominate the evening sky. For the first time, he wondered if he had underestimated more than just their physical capabilities. The thought made his defensive scales rise involuntarily. Tomorrow, he decided, it would require some adjustments to his approach. Clearly, these humans needed more challenging tasks and harder work to properly humble them. The fact that this decision aligned with his superior's productivity quotas was, he assured himself, entirely coincidental. The next 3 days were intense with agricultural labor. The humans maintained their military bearing, but small signs of dissatisfaction crept into their performance. Ethan's shoulders grew increasingly rigid during morning formations. Jacob's responses became clipped, the bare minimum required by protocol. Lucas stopped asking about Anzian military traditions altogether, his usual enthusiasm replaced by a calculating silence. Still, they worked. They worked with the grim determination of soldiers enduring a forced march, their movements precise, but stripped of any eagerness to learn. Orlo noted their changing demeanor with satisfaction, interpreting their quiet displeasure as the natural result of his carefully crafted deception. Sir? Ethan had asked on the second afternoon, pausing in his work with the cinderthorn blooms. When do we begin weapons training? Patience, cadet. First you must master the fundamentals. Orlo had savored the flash of frustration in the human's eyes. Later that day, he'd overheard Jacob muttering to Lucas between rows of jade gourds. There has to be more than this. The Anzians wouldn't waste resources shipping us across the galaxy just to harvest fruit, would they? Maybe it's like that ancient Earth technique," Lucas had replied, his voice heavy with forced optimism. "You know, wax on, wax off." "If I have to wax one more fang fruit," Jacob grumbled, "I'm going to consider deserting before this mission ends." By the end of that day, their questions had all but ceased. When Orlo announced another round of crop rotation exercises for tomorrow, he caught Ethan staring at the red moon, his fists clenched tight. The cadet had turned away quickly, but not before Orlo glimpsed something dangerous in his expression. Not anger, but something else. On the morning of the fourth day, Orlo arrived at the usual assembly point to find it empty. His throat frill contracted in irritation as he checked his time-telling device. The humans had never been late before. It was one of their few admirable qualities. He marched to their quarters, ready to deliver a stern lecture about Anzian military punctuality. The door slid open to reveal 3 perfectly made beds and no occupants. The basic cleaning unit still ran its morning cycle, suggesting they had departed some time ago. Orlo's irritation deepened into concern. He spent the next several hours searching the cultivation zones, checking each greenhouse and storage facility. The agricultural drones continued their endless routines around him, indifferent to his growing agitation. He even checked the fence line, though the security's sensors showed no breaches. By midday, the sun blazed overhead, and Orlo's scales felt uncomfortably dry from constant movement. He stood in the center of the field, his auxiliary breathing vents working overtime as he considered contacting his superiors. The embarrassment of losing 3 human cadets would be difficult to explain. A glint of light caught his eye, something reflecting off the ancient Caladium ship's hull. He'd passed it several times during his search, but now, something seemed different. The layer of dust that had accumulated over centuries appeared disturbed in places. Fresh marks scored the soil around its landing struts. Orlo approached slowly, his defensive scales rising. As he drew closer, he noticed other changes. Panels that had been corroded shut for generations showed signs of recent movement. The external access port's status light, dead for centuries, now pulsed with a faint green glow. "If you humans have been anywhere near this vessel," he began, drawing himself up for a properly thunderous reprimand. The words died in his throat as a deep vibration rumbled through the ground. Ancient engines, long considered beyond repair, roared to life. The sound sent nearby drones scattering in automated panic, their programming recognizing a threat of a cloud of dust rising from the ground. The ship's hull vibrated as centuries of accumulated grime sloughed away, revealing metallurgy that still defied Anzian understanding. Emergency vents opened along its flanks, releasing jets of pressurized gas that flattened the surrounding crops. The entire vessel shuddered, straining against gravity's hold. Orlo stood frozen, his translator struggling to process the string of profanity flooding his mind. The impossible ship rose from the field with the grace of a predator uncoiling, its shadow passing over him like a physical weight. His throat frill extended fully as he watched the vessel orient itself not toward the distant stars where they would return home, but toward the red moon hanging in the afternoon sky. The Caladium ship accelerated with a sudden burst, its course aimed directly at the Inzian colony as the dust settled on Orlo's head. Only when the ship pierced the upper atmosphere did Orlo's mind finally process what his eyes had seen before takeoff. 3 human figures were visible through the bridge viewport as Cadet Lucas offered him a crisp military salute with his middle finger. Orlo stood, rooted to the spot long after the ship had vanished into the crimson glare of the moon. His throat frill still fully extended in shock. His crisis mode only kicked in minutes later, and he activated his neural implant's communication protocols. "Superior Zerlo," he transmitted, forcing his voice into something approaching military decorum. "We have an emergency situation." "Commander Orlo," came the unhurried response. "Please maintain proper communication protocols when initiating emergency contacts." Orlo's scales tensed in frustration, but he complied. "Superior Zerlo, I respectfully report that the 3 human cadets under my supervision have somehow repaired and stolen an ancient Caladium vessel previously considered irreparable by our finest engineers." A long pause followed. "Commander, how long have you been exposed to the sun today?" "Sir, I know what I saw. The ship rose from the field like it had never been damaged. They're heading toward the Inzian colony. I just know they are. This could be a diplomatic disaster." "I see." Zerlo's tone carried the kind of patience reserved for hatchlings claiming to have seen monsters in their sleep chambers. "And these humans, whom you were supposed to be training in our war methods, somehow managed to repair a ship that has defied our engineering corps for centuries." "Yes." "And they didn't return home, but decided to invade the Inzians' colony?" "Well, yes, but perhaps," Zerlo suggested delicately, "you should visit the medical bay. Extended sun exposure can have curious effects on one's perception of reality." Half an hour later, after equally fruitless communications with 3 other superior officers and the Planetary Defense Command, Orlo found himself trudging toward the FTL communication station. Each of his superiors had suggested increasingly lengthy periods of medical leave, with the last one helpfully recommending a specialist in brain damage hallucinations. The journey to the communication facility took nearly 2 hours, mostly because the transport drone insisted on stopping at every designated agricultural checkpoint along the way. By the time Orlo reached the facility, his scales had begun to shed from stress. The communication officer, a young Anzian whose scales hadn't even developed their adult coloration, regarded him with professional disinterest. "Your authorization code, please." 15 minutes of bureaucratic verification later, Orlo finally stood before the FTL terminal. The human captain who appeared on the screen looked impossibly relaxed for someone about to receive news of an interstellar incident. "3 of your cadets," Orlo began, fighting to keep his throat frill from extending, "have repaired an ancient warship and used it to invade an Inzian colony." The captain took a leisurely sip from a container marked "coffee" before responding. "Which cadets?" "Jacob, Ethan, and Lucas." "Ah." The captain nodded as if this explained everything. "Those 3. Well, that's about par for the course. We sent them to train with a non-warrior species for a reason." Orlo's translator must have malfunctioned. I don't understand. They've violated multiple treaties. They've stolen irreplaceable technology. They're approaching a colony of apex predators." "Sounds like they're showing initiative." The captain made a note on something outside the video's feed's range. "Good to see they're maintaining the standard we expect from our cadets." But the Inzians." "Oh, I wouldn't worry about that. Our cadets wouldn't put themselves or anyone else under life-threatening danger. Usually." The captain checked something off screen. "Here, tell you what. Why don't you submit a full report through our proper channels, and we'll handle things from our end. Give it a few hours for processing." The screen went dark before Orlo could protest further. He stood there, watching his reflection in the blank display, noting how his scales had developed stress spots in irregular patterns. Above the communication facility, visible through a transparent panel in the ceiling, the red moon continued its transit across the sky, now carrying 3 humans and 1 irreplaceable piece of ancient technology toward what would surely become an interstellar incident. As the first sun began to set, Orlo decided to return to the agricultural field. Someone would have to explain the missing ship, and it seemed increasingly unlikely that anyone believed his story. And perhaps if he arrived early enough tomorrow, he could pretend this had all been a particularly vivid hallucination. Time passed, and the field felt unnaturally silent without the constant bickering of his human charges. Orlo moved between the rows of damaged crops, cataloging the losses in the small area of destruction caused by the Caladium ship's departure. His throat frill contracted at the sight of flattened jade gourds and scattered cinderthorn blooms. The agricultural board would demand explanations, and somehow, impossible ship stolen by humans seemed unlikely to satisfy their inquiries. The evening ensured the red moon could be seen in the sky, its crimson glow intensifying as night approached. Orlo found himself staring at it more frequently, searching for any sign of movement, perhaps explosions. He then sighed and settled into his observation post. The automated drones continued their programmed routines, indifferent to the chaos of recent events. Yet, when he thought things couldn't possibly get worse, the first indication that something was wrong came from the drones themselves. Their synchronized movements suddenly faltered, their sensors detecting a disturbance in the upper atmosphere. Orlo's defensive scales rose as a familiar vibration began to build beneath his feet. The Caladium ship burst through the cloud cover like a wounded predator, its ancient hull glowing cherry red from atmospheric entry. It careened across the sky, trailing smoke and debris as its pilots attempted to maintain control. Orlo watched in horror as it descended toward his carefully maintained field, its trajectory suggesting less of a landing and more of a controlled crash. "Oh, not the Cinderthorn section," he muttered, his auxiliary breathing vents fluttering in distress. "No, not the—" The ship plowed into the field's eastern quarter, carving a deep furrow through rows of perfectly arranged crops. It finally came to rest at an awkward angle, its nose buried in soil worth more than Orlo's yearly salary. Steam hissed from its hull as emergency cooling systems engaged, creating an eerie fog that drifted across the devastation. Orlo approached cautiously, his instincts warning him that something even worse was about to happen. Through the settling dust, he could hear voices arguing inside the ship. "I told you the approach vector was too steep!" That was definitely Ethan's voice. "Maybe if someone hadn't spilled moonshine on the navigation controls." Jacob's reply cut off abruptly as a third voice joined the argument. "Both of you shut up. He's coming." Lucas's warning was followed by the sound of frantic movement. The ship's main hatch cycled open with a noise of equalized pressure. The three humans emerged, their uniforms in various states of disarray. Ethan's jacket was missing entirely, while Jacob's bore what appeared to be scratch marks. Lucas had somehow acquired a piece of jewelry he didn't have before. "Sir!" All three snapped to attention, executing perfect salutes despite their disheveled appearance. "We swear we didn't drink and drive. We can explain." Orlo's throat frill extended to its full width. "You will explain immediately. You will explain how you repaired an irreparable ship. You will explain why you violated restricted airspace. You will explain—" He stopped, noticing something odd about their formation. They seemed to be positioning themselves very deliberately between him and the ship's entrance. "About that, sir." Ethan began shifting slightly to better block the hatch. It's actually a really funny story." A crash from inside the ship interrupted him. Something that sounded suspiciously like giggling followed. "What?" Orlo's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Was that?" "It's equipment settling," Lucas offered hopefully. Another crash, louder this time. The giggling increased, accompanied by what Orlo's translator suggested was singing. His scales turned pale as he recognized the melody. A traditional Indian warrior's song. "Step aside," he ordered, his military authority reasserting itself. "That's a direct order." The humans exchanged glances. "Sir," Jacob said carefully, "maybe we should discuss this somewhere else. Perhaps over coffee, or several strong drinks." Before Orlo could respond, the ship's hatch opened. Again, a tall figure stumbled out, caught herself on the frame, and fixed her eyes on Orlo. The round shape of her three breasts were hidden behind her ceremonial armor, clearly designed for someone of her proportions. A bottle of something that definitely wasn't standard Indian drinks dangled from one of her hands. "Oh no," all three humans said in perfect unison. The Indian woman stumbled out, caught herself with surprising grace, and fixed her gaze on Ethan. Her eyes sparkled with mischief as she steadied herself against the ship's frame. High cheekbones framed with a face that managed to be both fierce and elegant, while her head crests shifted in what Orlo identified as unmistakable signs of attraction. "You must be the uptight one they told me about." Her voice, though carrying the slight slur of someone who had recently discovered human distillation techniques, held a warmth reserved for Ethan.
The one who's always talking about how dangerous and scary we are.
She leaned closer to Ethan, her warrior's armor glinting in the sunlight. Her smile softened as she gazed at the human.
Your commanding officer is exactly how you described him. Kixara,
Ethan said softly, a grin spreading across his face despite his attempt at seriousness. Remember what we discussed about cultural sensitivity? 2 more Inzian women emerged from the ship, their own armor suspiciously disheveled. The first, her midnight blue headcrests adorned with rare flowers, and her arm draped affectionately around Jacob's shoulders. The second, carrying a makeshift musical instrument, cobbled together from ship parts, kept stealing glances at Lucas, her eyes softening every time he looked her way.
Don't worry about your commander,
Kixara purred, her hand finding Ethan's as she spoke.
I'm sure he'll understand once we explain everything.
Look how his scales change color when he's embarrassed, the first Inzian said, taking a step closer to Orlo. Oh, that's so precious. As his vision began to blur around the edges, Orlo found himself focusing on the absurd details. The way Lucas was trying to hide an empty bottle behind his back. The fact that Jacob had somehow acquired traditional Inzian face paint and some strange scratches on his neck. The distinctive smell of fermented jade gourd that wafted from the ship's interior. Sir? Ethan's voice seemed to come from very far away. Sir, I know this looks bad, but I promise we can explain everything. Sir, maybe you should sit down. Sir, your scales are turning an interesting color. The last thing Orlo saw before his emergency stress response kicked in was the first Inzian woman wrapping her arms around Ethan. Her 3 eyes fixed this human with what his translator unhelpfully suggested was romantic intent. Orlo, doing his best to remain calm, finally overcame his shock. This is a direct violation of the 1,000-year agreement, he sputtered, his throat frill extending to its full warning display. No Inzian is permitted on colonial soil without... Actually, Lucas interjected helpfully. Technically, we're still on the ship's boarding ramp, which counts as Caladium territory according to subsection 47B of the... Silence! Orlo's voice reached a pitch that sent nearby agricultural drones scattering. You have violated sacred treaties. You've stolen historical artifacts. You have corrupted apex predators with unauthorized fermented beverages. The 3 Inzian women exchanged looks at the word corrupted. Their head crests bristled in perfect synchronization as their 3 pupiled eyes began to glow with an inner fire. The temperature around them dropped noticeably as psionic energy gathered in the air. Oh no, Ethan muttered, stepping back and pulling Kira with him. Sir, maybe you should rephrase... Too late. The psionic storm erupted around them. Agricultural drones scattered crops, and loose equipment began to rise into the air, caught in a telekinetic vortex of impressive proportions. Orlo found himself levitating several feet off the ground, his throat frill contracting in terror as he rotated slowly in midair, losing all sense of up and down. Now, ladies, Jacob said soothingly, placing a gentle hand on his companion's shoulder. Remember what we discussed about proportional responses. He called us corrupted, the Inzian with the flower-adorned crests protested, though Orlo noticed the dangerous glow in her eyes dimmed slightly at Jacob's touch. He didn't mean it, Lucas added, carefully extracting his musical Inzian's fingers from the makeshift instrument before she could use it as a projectile. Remember how long it took us to explain the side effects of moonshine? Speaking of which, Kixara hiccuped, her concentration wavering enough that several floating objects dropped back to Earth. Maybe we should have waited until we were sober to make first contact. First contact? Orlo's voice cracked on the words. The Inzians have been our neighbors for centuries. How can they forget us? Yeah, but it's our first contact. She's just a little confused. Ethan grinned, steadying Kixara as she swayed slightly. Did you know they've been watching our Earth entertainment broadcasts for decades? They're huge fans of ancient human courtship rituals. Something about romance movies really resonated with their warrior culture. Especially the ones about forbidden love, Lucas's Inzian added cheerfully, finally letting the last of the agricultural equipment settle back to ground. Orlo dropped to the ground with a thud that knocked the breath from his auxiliary vents. We just helped bridge a cultural gap, Jacob explained, brushing some flower petals from his uniform, and maybe started a long-lasting cultural exchange program of our own. 3 days later, Orlo sat in the improvised meeting place they had arranged, watching as his superiors struggled to process the situation. The general's scales had developed stress patterns that mirrored his own. "Let me understand this clearly," Superior Zerlo said, consulting his datapad for the 7th time. "Not only did the humans repair an irreparable ship and make unauthorized first contact with the Indians, but they've also established a preliminary trade agreement for human distillation techniques," the human captain's hologram supplied helpfully, "and possibly arranged 3 cross-species marriages. The paperwork is still being processed." "The Caladium ship?" the general asked faintly. "Already paid for." Zerlo nodded. "The humans have transferred sufficient rare earth metals to cover its value. They're considering it a wedding gift, though we are the ones getting the gift, and the human cadets should be happy to keep their freedom." "And the diplomatic implications of violating the 1,000-year agreement?" "Oh, that's been sorted by the humans," the captain waved dismissively. "The Indian High Council is thrilled. No one had dared to invade them before, so they got to experience it for the first time." Orlo sat in stunned silence as the meeting continued around him. His carefully maintained worldview had been systematically dismantled over the past week, replaced by a reality where humans could repair ancient technology through sheer stubbornness, and fearsome warrior races could be won over with badly fermented fruit and sweet nothings. "One last thing," Zerlo added as the meeting drew to a close. "The cadets wanted me to pass along a message to Commander Orlo." Orlo's scales rippled with apprehension. "Yes?" "They said to thank you for the excellent agricultural training. Apparently the Indians were very impressed by their... what did they call it? Their strong, capable hands developed through ancient Anzian military techniques." Zerlo's image disappeared before Orlo could respond. As the chamber emptied, Orlo found himself alone with his thoughts. Through the window, he could see the red moon hanging in the evening sky. Soon it would host a unique diplomatic mission. 3 humans, 3 Indians, and enough moonshine to probably violate several more ancient treaties. He touched his throat frill absently, remembering the humans' arrival just weeks ago. They had been thrust upon him as an inconvenience, a problem to be managed through deception and manual labor. Instead, they had managed to repair an ancient starship, forge an unprecedented alliance with apex predators, and revolutionize multiple diplomatic agreements, all at the cost of their already questionable military bearing. Perhaps, Orlo reflected as he gathered his dignity and headed for the exit, he had been asking the wrong questions all along. The real mystery wasn't whether humans were insane. That much was very obvious now. The real question was whether the galaxy would survive to their particular brand of insanity, now that even the Indians seemed to be infected by it.